be sure to follow me on Instagram. There you can hang out with me and talk to me directly. Okay, so it all starts here, and I'm really excited to see to see what Jonathan Hickman does with this. This is X-Men Volume 5, Issue number 1, also known as Dawn of X, and I am very excited about this. For those of you guys who are a little confused about this, here's an important thing to understand. Volumes in comic books are a weird thing, right? Like technically volume denotes an entire run, but it's like volumes within a volume, right? So you have like the overarching volume, which is, this is however many iterations of this comic we've had. Technically, we've had 5 iterations or 5 relaunches of the X-Men comic. The first one was Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. That was the original X-Men run that was canceled. The second one was X-Men Volume 2, Issue number 1, which came in 1991. And then there were a whole bunch of others after that, and we're currently on 5. You had like all new, all different Marvel. You had the post Heroes Reborn. You had the post House of M, the Heroic Age. You had like all kinds of different relaunches over the years in Marvel. That's why this is Volume 5. Within Volume 5, you'll have the first however many issues make up the first story arc, which will be like Volume 1. So it'll be X-Men Volume 5, Volume 1. I know it's kind of weird. It's a little strange, but nonetheless, this picks up with an attack on Orchis. See, this is why I say you have to read Jonathan Hickman from beginning to the end, right? Because Hickman is not gonna do House of X and then Powers of X and then treat Dawn of X like it's a whole new relaunch. No, the relaunch came with the prelude, right? So you just kind of keep on reading as if everything's just kind of always been. But the attack on Orchis is actually kind of interesting here because it's not the X-Men launching an attack in the traditional sense, like, oh my God, there's humans here, we have to get them. It's the X-Men launching like really more of like a rescue mission than anything else. But I really like the way that Hickman is doing this, right? Because he depicts the X-Men as, we're going in there to achieve a mission. That's what the council calls for. Whatever happens, happens. I like the brazen nature of the X-Men now, right? Because up until this point, and this is one of the things that I wasn't a huge fan of, up until this point, really coming after all new, all different Marvel, the X-Men always kind of seemed like a team that was on the defensive, right? Like they're always backing off. They're always, retreating or something along those lines. They're never really like launching an attack against someone, like making the first move. And I like this. The X-Men are kind of going in and they're doing their thing. It's very much a throwback to the old school X-Men comics. I know I sound like a comic book hipster, but I do kind of like the throwback to the whole thing. Of course, now the mission is led by Storm and Cyclops, and this is no accident when it comes to this. Like when Hickman really put together the council and you have Storm and Cyclops leading field missions, Hickman chose this for a reason, right? Because there's a lot of history here. Storm and Cyclops are kind of like the 1-2 punch when it comes to leading the X-Men team, right? Cyclops was a field commander for a long, long time until after the events of the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas when he left. And then Storm became the new leader of the team after she battled Cyclops for that role, and she won. And so as a result of that, Storm led the X-Men team while Cyclops led X-Factor. And then once the two teams merged back into a single unit again, you got X-Men Gold and X-Men Blue. Cyclops led one team, Storm led the other. So it makes sense that like Hickman's sort of bringing all that history in and giving us these two characters who are going out and doing their own thing. The other big thing about this is the arrival of Magneto. Now here's the thing, man. Hickman does an amazing job of writing villains. I think Hickman writes villains better than he writes heroes. Believe it or not, go back and look at his publishing history and it's like the villains are almost always written better than the heroes. And that's what I love about the way that Magneto is done here, because in the last 5 years or so, Magneto's almost kind of been like a background character. Cyclops sort of took on the role that used to belong to Magneto, right? Like this kind of militaristic, we'll do whatever we need to do to win kind of situation. And it was cool to see the evolution of his character, to see him go from like the X-Men Boy Scout to casting Xavier out of his own team after House of M, taking the X-Men over, saying, I'm the one running the show now, falling more in line with Magneto's views. But Magneto kind of fell more to the background. And to see Magneto kind of brought to the forefront again and really kind of drawn and depicted in this way where he's like this imposing figure, like, crap, Magneto's here. Like, I like seeing that. Like, I love seeing that depiction, because it's just like, you're talking about this insanely powerful mutant, right? I think in a lot of ways, people sleep on just how powerful Magneto is. And I feel like before this all really comes to an end, before Hickman's run ends, we're going to see Magneto shine in spectacular fashion. To say nothing of that suit. Magneto looks like a boss in that white silver suit. Dude, it looks legit. But nonetheless, it's cool to kind of see him arrive here, because Polaris is like, let's take care of these humans. And it's like, no, we're here for a mission. We're here to achieve a mission for the council. Now, this is a big deal. And this is a very important thing to take note of, because what this shows is that at the end of the day, Magneto really does fall in line with the ideology that they're ensuing, right? Because one of the things he says here is like, there was a time when I would have just taken all these humans out, right? Like I would have just eradicated them all. And it's not a matter of annihilating humanity. It's a matter of achieving that goal right there. And that's one of the big differences. Back in the day, back in like the 80s and 90s, Magneto would have just taken them out. And that would have been the end of that, right? He would have just melted these guys or just kind of destroyed them. And that would have been the end of them. But to see him in a position now where he's just sort of like, we're here to achieve a particular goal, it's awesome to kind of see that progression. But with them showing up here, with the X-Men arriving here, that's what we end up realizing. The reason why they're here is because what they're doing is rescuing all these various mutants. But one of these mutants stands out. And when the system more or less opens up, right? This kind of, cocoon, stasis pod, whatever it is, opens up and this mutant pours out, then the initial analysis is, well, they're not really human, but they're not really mutant. They're kind of post-human, but something's going on here with regards to time. Now, if you're not familiar with Hickman writing, if you're not familiar with the stuff he's done in the past, you would just kind of be like, what in the world is going on here? But if you read the Ultimate Universe, if you read Ultimates by Jonathan Hickman, that's a child of the Vault. And it's just like, wow, dude, I can't believe he brought him back. Like, I can't believe he's bringing back Children of the Vault. At least that's what it looks like. The only other thing I can assume here is that it's the Black Vault or something else going on there, but I don't think it's Black Vault. Like, literally they say like some kind of like temporal energy is coming off this girl. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Children of the Vault, dude, it was so cool. This was a concept. I've got the videos down in the description so you guys can go watch those. But the Children of the Vault was this concept created by Reed Richards in the Ultimate Universe. And what he did was create this place called City, this great big huge citadel. And what ended up happening here is that within the confines of City, time passed differently. And so what Reed could do is he could basically create life and then watch it grow over the course of however long. And it was something like 6,000 years passed within the span of like a few days or something along those lines. But basically he created like post-humans, right? People who evolve beyond normal humans. And this is awesome because what it means is the plot thickens. Because now not only do we have to deal with Omega Sentinels, we have all the stuff that we saw with regards to like the Nimrods and all those things going on in House and Powers of X. Now we've got post-humans making their return. And this is awesome because post-humans are basically superhumans. It's awesome to see Hickman bring it back. The downside of this is this child of the Vault immediately teleports out. She's just like, I gotta go. Like we got to bounce out of here. Keep that in the back of your head. Do not forget that will become important later on. I promise you, that will become insanely important later on. Do not forget that. Please, for the love of God, do not forget that. It will become important later on. But nonetheless, once they get back to Krakoa, it's kind of interesting there because Storm has more or less been running on fumes since she's been here, grabbing these mutants that were held inside the hub and bringing them back to this location. It's fine for what it is, right? Because it's kind of like, hey, they're going to get some medical treatment and they're all going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. Remember, Krakoa is a totally self-contained ecosystem, right? So they've got telepaths to deal with like any sort of mental anguish they've been through. Krakoa itself creates various medicines and things they can use in order to heal themselves or, recover from whatever they're struggling from. But then following that, you've also got the return of Magneto. Now notice this, when Magneto arrives here, he's almost perceived as like a savior of sorts. And this is really Hickman tying into the history of Magneto, right? Like on the surface, you would look at it and say, well, Magneto, dude, this guy's a jerk, man. He's a glory hog. Like, yes, everyone, I freed you all. Me, alone, by myself, I did it. And it's like, okay, Magneto, get a little carried away with yourself. But no. Magneto has always been viewed in a lot of ways by the mutant population as kind of a mutant messiah-esque character. Not insofar as they would follow him into oblivion, right? I mean, he doesn't always have everybody on his side, but the perception of Magneto and the way in which he operates is he's not really a bad guy. Magneto was a guy who was just kind of like, I'm doing what's best for mutant kind. I'll take the heavy-handed approach if I need to, right? But like first and forefront is the mutant population. He's a champion of mutants, right? And where Xavier was more of a half measure, more of like, well, let's see if we can't talk to them. Let's see if we can't reason with them. And, we can get them to listen. Like Magneto was like, no, you can't either. So like either they can listen or they can be made to listen. But ears are going to be listening to what it is we have to say. It's the nature of things, right? Like violence is not always the answer, but it is a answer, and it's a very effective answer, right? Magneto got stuff done, and it's a cool thing about his character. And so him showing up here, people are kind of like, well, what if they come back? And the response to Magneto, it's the most boss response ever. He says, let man run from me. Dude, Magneto is a boss. I love the way he's written in this. It's absolutely amazing. But it's a cool thing here because what you end up doing is you end up having Scott Summers, who basically travels out to meet up with the rest of his family. But before we do, we've got Jonathan Hickman establishing, in a lot of ways, the current status quo of things, which is to say, the new villain who's on the scene. And this is a guy named Director Davo. Now, Director Davo is the one who really sort of spearheaded this whole Orcus system, right? At least that seems to be the case. He's the one that gathered together all these various scientists from like S.H.I.E.L.D. and Armor and Hammer and Hydra and so on and so forth, all for the purpose of trying to find a way to basically contain and control the mutant threat, right? So it's almost like a reworked version of Project Wide Awake. For those of you guys who never read comics back in the 80s and 90s, which technically I wasn't really alive at that point, but I went back and read them anyway. For those of you guys who weren't really reading when the events of the original Project Wide Awake were happening, it wasn't really like a one-shot. It was just like a page here, 3 or 4 pages there. It was just kind of spread all over the place. And when you go back and you read it, you read like the entirety of Chris Claremont's run, you get this great big huge cohesive concept that we call Project Wide wide awake. This was very similar to that in terms of how this is being done and how it's being depicted. You get a couple pages here and then you move on, right? That's kind of how this whole thing sort of unfolded in the old Claremont stories. And it's cool to see that method of storytelling kind of being maintained here. But the idea is that this guy, Director Davo, is the one who's basically like, hey, look, this is the entire like creation of Mother Mold, all that kind of stuff. That's all me. And it's one of these things where he sort of ignores what it is that Karima's telling him, right? Remember, Karima is an Omega Sentinel. She's basically more machine than she is human. But the idea behind this is she's like, what you were doing was going to spark a response. You had to know that. You had to know that like creating a Sentinel that created Master Molds, which in turn would create other Sentinels, you had to know the X-Men were going to respond to that. You instigated a scenario where the X-Men were guaranteed to respond, and when they did, they ended up killing a handful of people who worked for you. And the response of Director Davo is, yes, but that's the step that needs to be taken. I'm doing the right thing. I'm fighting on behalf of humanity. Notice this. It's kind of an extreme perspective, but it exists opposed to Magneto's views, right? Where Magneto is steadfast protecting mutant kind. This guy, Director Davo, like so many villains before him, is steadfast protecting humanity. And this is cool. This is an interesting idea because what he does is he basically says like the fall of like Mother Mold, that's nothing. Like we have a whole host of things that are working in the background, a whole host of things that we want to get done from here. And so it's cool because what it says is what we saw in House of Powers of X, that's not the end of it. It's nowhere near the end of it. It's a very small thing. Now, at this point, we transition over to Scott Summers along with like pretty much his whole family. You also get Gabriel Summers here. Now, here's an important thing to understand. Gabriel Summers died during and in the aftermath of War of Kings, right? He wasn't really killed. He was kind of yanked away into like a black hole, more or less, some kind of gravity well. Black Bolt ended up coming back. We never found out what happened to Gabriel. We never found out what happened to Vulcan. He was just gone. Now, a lot of that was part of the lead up to Secret Wars. And so Marvel, I imagine, if it was just kind of a thing where it was like, well, they're more or less gone, don't really worry about explaining it, just kind of leave it the way it is, and then whatever happens, happens. That kind of seems to have been a lot of the response with what was going on there. And so this is really like the first real time we're seeing Vulcan after the events of Secret Wars and all new, all different Marvel. But he's a good guy here, right? There's no semblance of like, I hate my brothers and I'm a bad guy and I conquered the Shi'ar Empire and I'm going to war with the Kree. Like, we don't really see any of that going on here. And there doesn't really seem to be any reference to it. It's just kind of a thing that's there. So I think Hickman's just sort of rolling with it and just kind of saying, hey, if you never really read anything about Vulcan before, don't worry about it. Just know that he's really powerful. He can control all forms of energy and he's Omega level. And that's really it. It's cool, but like, that's pretty much it. And it's interesting to see, and it works. And not only that, you have these small things that go on. For example, like you literally got Cable hanging out with Raza. Now, of course, Raza is like the weapons guy. He's almost kind of like the gunsmith, so to speak, of the Starjammers group. And it's interesting to see because like he's got like these super advanced weapons, and Cable, like little kid Cable's like freaking out, like, I've got to see that, you know, and so on and so forth. For those of you guys who aren't really familiar with what's going on here, let me backpedal a little bit. Let me offer some explanation. So when it comes to the Starjammers, this was an idea introduced way back during Chris Claremont's run. And what he did is he said initially it was believed that Cyclops and his brother were thrown out of a plane, given parachutes, and they landed, you know, more or less safely after their plane crashed, after their plane went down. Claremont came back and changed some of that and said, actually, the Shi'ar abducted his mother and his father. And they were just kind of taken out into space. And eventually his mom died. And Corsair, who's a leader of the Starjammers, formed the Starjammers as was essentially a pirate group out there, right? They're space pirates, right? So think of them as like a pirate version of the Guardians of the Galaxy from what you've seen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in a lot of ways. Because of that, they're pretty capable, but these are the members that you're basically seeing here, right? Raza and Hepzibah, you know, you're seeing like Chode, you're seeing a lot of these characters here who are just part of the Starjammers group. And the reason why they're here is there's a lot of history there, right? The Starjammers are like extended family for Scott Summers, right? Corsair is his biological dad, and then the Starjammers are part of the team. So it's like a Cyclops brought his own X-Men, you know, to this kind of family thing. There's been a lot of history. These teams have fought side by side with each other. There's a lot of closeness that goes on between these guys. With regards to Cable being a kid, this was covered in the new X-Force run that I think was written by Greg Pak, although I'm not going to swear to it. But the idea is that you had Cable, who's been around for a long, long time, right? Like the adult version of Cable. Because of the fact that he's gone back in time and messed with the time stream so much, his younger counterpart killed him. He was just like, you've been screwing up time consistently since you've been alive, right? Like you're a walking retcon machine. Like the X-Men are like, hey, we want to do something, or the Avengers want to do something, and then here comes Cable jumping out of a crack in the ground. Don't do that, guys. You're going to screw up the time stream. You're kind of a hassle. So basically, like his younger self ended up killing him off. And it was a way for Marvel anyway to kind of remove the idea that Cable's just sort of going to fix everything all the time. And so that's why his younger counterpart is currently here. Now, we also talked about that in the Return of Cyclops, right? When Cyclops was resurrected, we covered that as well. So you guys are welcome to go check that out. But there's some cool discussion that goes on. Now, one of the important things that really takes place here is Corsair starts talking to Cyclops, and he says, look, man, I can't agree with everything that you're doing here. It's cool that you guys have formed your own island nation, but you have to understand humanity is coming from the perspective of fear. And so what you've basically done here is you've created an island, you've created a nation state unto yourself. And then you've gathered every single person that humanity is afraid of into a singular location. As far as humanity is concerned, you're making war preparations. It's, you could be doing anything. You could be gathering all these mutants together and then training them to become like, military capable, and then you're going to send them out into the world and conquer humanity. You could be training them to become humanitarians, so they're going to go out and they're going to heal the world. But because humanity is governed by fear in this regard, they're going to deviate to the worst case scenario. So yes, it's cool that you're doing that, but you might also be creating more problems than you are benefits. At the end of the day though, Cyclops' response is, we'll deal with that threat as it comes. For right now, we're doing the right thing. We're protecting our kind as best we can. So it's one of these things where it's like what the X-Men are doing on Earth has not gone unnoticed across the entirety of the universe. And it makes sense, right? Because some of the most powerful people are on Earth. And so Earth is constantly monitored by all these various extraterrestrial races, because who in the heck knows when things are going to pop off, right? So as a result of this, what we end up doing is we end up jumping back to the Orcus base, and we end up having this conversation that takes place with Director Davo. And one of the things about this is that Killian's wife, remember, she was a scientist who was on board one of the vessels when Killian himself was destroyed. The response to Davo is, like where they're talking about that, and he's like, yes, some of this is my fault, but at the end of the day, we're doing the right thing. This chick is just kind of like, hey, look, I'm not too worried about that because we can bring my husband back. Now, this is a very easy thing to overlook because it's like, okay, so like whatever, she can bring her husband back. That's not the takeaway from this. Who cares if her husband comes back? Nobody cares if Killian comes back. What matters about this is that if she can resurrect her husband, she can resurrect anybody else. And that means that we could see the return of Ball of our Trask. We could see the return of like almost any of these characters out there who have or could possibly continue to be major threats against the mutant population, right? So like William Stryker leading the Purifiers, different things like that. Like imagine if that was the case, right? You have the Purifiers of William Stryker, basically this crazy religious fundamentalist, evangelical group who thinks God wants them to kill mutants, and they're backed by like some of the best science and technology in the Marvel universe, right? Like they have all this money and all this technology backing them. Who knows what kind of strikes they could launch against all of mutant kind? And so it's cool to see. There's a lot of possibilities that can come out of this, and that's why things like this are so important. Is because it's not the immediate statement that's made by virtue of I can resurrect my husband. It's all the possibilities that can come out of it, all the things that can come later on down the line, because that's the nature of Jonathan Hickman writing. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.